I want you to set this up, number one. Demand is relatively elastic, and supply is relatively inelastic. Okay, draw it. One mark. All right, why do I use the term relatively? Why do I use the term relatively? Yeah.
Because in every demand and supply curve, in the curve, there's a part that's elastic and inelastic, and so it's relative, or the elasticity in this case is relative to the other curve.
Yes, exactly. Because where they intersect, P and Q are the same. And because P and Q are the same where they intersect, we can use that formula, 1 over slope times P over Q is the elasticity. And therefore, the only thing we need to compare is the slope. Only there. It's the only time. You can only look at the slope. Everybody? Very good. What's your name again, sorry?
Erica.
Erica? Yeah. Good. So, I will draw it, and you tell me whether I drew this correctly, because people will draw it like this on the exam. What do you think? Is that going to get a mark? No. You must show something relatively steep, if you will, relatively elastic in this case. So this is relatively flat. And it must be relative to the other. They can't look virtually the same, right? So this is that. Something like that will be perfectly fine. Okay, good. So that's your beginning point, 1 mark on this exam. Now, I'm also going to say, and I'm going to call this, say, $10. This is $10, but it's also PO. I don't necessarily want to, when we do diagrams, you don't necessarily have to have numbers. But I'm going to say to you, I want, there's going to be a tax per unit. Tax per unit of $1. Okay? Now, I should, strictly speaking, say on sellers, which means it's the shift of the supply function. But I don't really need to say that. I hope not forget to say that. But for us, it'll always be in sellers. I don't want you shifting the demand function. And I want you to I'll say to you, in reference to the original $10 plus the tax, so I want you to show here a line something like this. I don't want you to shift it up. I want this to be E0 plus tax. And I want you to have some sort of line like this. And now I want your move to be in relationship to that. If it isn't, you'll lose a mark. Okay, now, I want you to show me the new equilibrium price and quantity for 2 marks, say, given this tax. All right, everybody? So, given it's $1, I'm going to shift it like this. And then this is the new equilibrium price and quantity. Okay? Now, are we ready for the next thing, the buyer's share? Are we ready for the buyer's share? Laura, go ahead. I'm waiting. I surely hope that you did not do that. If you did that, you were wrong. Laura, tell them what they should have done.
You don't shift it like that. You measure the dollar up from the equilibrium, so the new equilibrium isn't going to be at 11, it'll be slightly less than 11.
Now again, yes, if you're charging $1 more, you can see that this is in fact many times more than $1. You need to shift it right here. And in fact, you should probably show, just to know that I absolutely know that you know know what you're doing, you should shift it and show me like that. Right there. That's the only place it's up by $1, right there. Right? So that's S0, the first one. And the other one is ST, same tax, or whatever. Okay? Now, if you shift it up, you'll get a mark. But if you shift it to the wrong place, you won't get a mark. And in particular, if you shift it up to here, you won't get a mark for the equilibrium because, again, as I say, this is an unbelievable fallacy. I keep reiterating. The fallacy is that producers can simply charge the public more and pass the tax on to them. They cannot. They cannot. And the reason they cannot is because of competition. If you try to charge your public $2 or $3 more on the cost of something because that gets you to a price that covers the tax completely and you don't have to absorb any of it, competition will drive that down. So competition is what's forcing the supply curve to only go up by $1. We'll think more about it. But, so therefore you get, this is the actual new equilibrium right here. Right there. So you identify that, and therefore, let me just move this. This right here, call this P1. This is P1. Everybody? Right there. And this, of course, is Q1, right here. And you'll identify these things. And so far, you've got 3 or 4 marks. Okay, I want the buyer's share of this. What is the buyer's share? On the diagram, show me the buyer's share of the tax per unit.
P0 plus tax minus.
I'm telling you, if you're not doing this in this class, doing this stuff, you are not learning. It's the way it is. It's the way it is. You will screw up on the exam, or you'll have to do more work on your own. If you do it here, you will be in good shape. It's that simple. And until you learn how to do that, you're never going to be able to do it. All right? It's really good. Okay. So, the buyer's share is where? Erica? P1 minus P0. All the buyer's share is this. It's the share that the buyers pay of the tax as determined by how much more the price goes up for them. Right? So basically, show it in some fashion or another that's very clear. And I'll just show it here like this. It's this distance here. It's the vertical distance. You don't have to do the whole area. It's this distance here, right? That's the buyer's share. Show it, and the diagram would be too much bother for me. But show it in some fashion or another. Another way I usually show it is like this. Some small little thing indicating the bracket. That's the buyer's share, everybody. And what do you think the buyer's share is? I say like 20 cents, everybody? 20 cents? So consumers are paying 20 cents more. Big deal. They won't even notice it. Okay, now, what is the seller's price? Identify the seller's price on this diagram. What is the price the sellers get after paying the tax? Okay, you would go, here's the equilibrium at Q, here's the price, subtract the tax from the equilibrium price P1, which means you drop back to the original supply function, which means here at Q1, and again, you've got to get handy by knowing that you're talking about Q1, and I want at Q1, not on Q0, I want at Q1, what this person gets. And they get this. So identify this as, I'll call it P sell. That's the seller's price. That's what the seller gets after paying the tax. In this case, say the new equipment price is $10.20, the seller gets $9.20. Everybody? Now the seller share on the diagram, the seller share of the diagram. And that is simply the difference between what the seller got before and the seller's price. So in our case, it turns out to be this vertical distance right here. Which is, say, 80 cents, right? Buyer share is 20 cents, the seller share is 80 cents in this case. Okay, now here's the deal. The GST, now by the way, I'm not talking about this because it only confuse you at this moment. You don't read me well, because I want you to concentrate on these basic ideas. In the long run is the period in which you can change the machines and the buildings and all the rest of it. In the long run, it turns out the price will go up by $1, and there'll be no seller share and blah, blah, blah. Don't worry about that. In the short run, this will happen. And the short run can be quite long because it depends on how long it takes to change the machines and the equipment. In some industries, that takes quite a while. So the whole, the whole idea of the GST is, hey, it's fair. Every penny pays the same percent. It's 13% on Coca-Cola, it's 13% on a house, it's 13% in a car. It's totally and utterly fair, right? Everybody pays 13% on every dollar they spend. So that tax is supposed to be fair. Now, I don't use a percentage tax because it adds a little bit more mathematical complexity, not much, but enough to be not worth our while. And there used to be, these are called specific taxes, per unit taxes, much easier to work with. But what we see here is, and we saw last day, if you have a per unit tax, like $1 across the board for everybody, everything that costs $10, we're going to add a tax of $1. Isn't this fair? It's 10%, right? Isn't it fair? But you see, it's not fair at all. It's not fair at all. It turns out in this case, the sellers end up paying most of the tax. In the case we did last day, at the end of the class, the buyers ended up paying most of the tax. And I gave you the example, when the GST was extended to haircuts, my price of a haircut never went up because it's so inelastic. So elastic. All that would happen is if he charges me more, I'll come 1 week later. So basically they have to, and also of course it's a cash industry, they can probably get away with it to some degree. But basically, when the GST is first imposed, certain industries, the producers, the sellers, really pay a lot of the tax. And the buyers pay hardly anything. Right? So it turns out to be flat out unfair in the first instance, and yet you think it was fair. Okay, now tell me why. In this case, the buyers are paying very little more and the sellers are paying a lot more. Tell me why. Yeah, go ahead.
Because the supply is relatively inelastic.
Yeah, so what happens is, when the tax goes up, the suppliers can't respond by changing quantity because they don't change the quantity very much. The buyers, they just change the quantity. They should buy a whole lot less. So the price doesn't go up. Right? So it turns out the effect of the tax is determined by relative supply and demand. Now I'm going to explore that in a minute with equations. We'll see that very clearly. But now I'm going to ask you this again. We're going to do this all over again. I'm going to do it for a subsidy. The subsidy will not be on this exam, but it might be on a future exam. Everybody? You think you know how to do this? Good. Use first principles and do the subsidy. We'll do it. Okay, so let's say with the subsidy, let's get rid of all this junk. A subsidy is the opposite of a tax. Subsidy is if instead of shifting supply up by $1, we're going to shift it down by $1. Everybody? So watch. We're going to have demand is relatively elastic. And supply is relatively inelastic. Okay, let's have it draw. And you would draw, say, I use linear here just because it's simpler. No, sorry, excuse me, supplies, did you do that already? But if you've already done it, I'm going to just switch it around. That's okay, it doesn't matter. It's the same one I asked before, so we'll just do this. that. And this. And equilibrium for $1. Now, we should be able to try when you walk going home. Do supply is totally elastic, it's perfectly elastic, and demand is inelastic, but not perfectly. Supply is totally inelastic, and demand is whatever. Try all these different ones. Normally I wouldn't ask you to draw them, but I might ask them in a multiple choice or somewhere along the way. Okay, good. Now, what I want you to do is, there's a subsidy equal to $1 per unit. Now, what a subsidy is, the government gives the supplier $1 for everything they sell, as opposed to taking $1 for everything they sell. So the supply function shifts down by $1, and of course you know we're going to use this here to represent that. So this is P0. This is P0 minus the subsidy. Okay? And this first one will be $10. And that particular point there will be $9. Okay? Good. So let's see the new equilibrium, price and quantity. Let's see you. What do you got? It looks beautiful. There's some stuff that looks beautiful, but it's not very economic. Come on, see it. My man. Every one of you, the rest of you are counting on all the rest of you to do well in the final. I need you to do it. Come on, go. I've been where you are. I'm telling you, you want to learn, do it. That's the way you learn. Let's see what you got. Beautiful. Let's see what you got. Probably right. Good. Good. Okay, good. The main thing, again, this is kind of amusing, but on exams, those people who don't do this stuff, on exams naturally, even if they can do the tax, they screw up and away they go, shoving this over here, going, right? Standard. I should have you all get up, we should do this. I said everybody do this in the page of the exam on Monday. Then I said, let's go up and walk around and let's see how everybody does this. And you'll be amazed how many people make the same dumb mistake. Okay, always, good technique. Shift down by $1. So we get this, the new equilibrium. You people are lucky. I'm not asking a subsidy on the exam, okay? But it's coming your way down the road. Okay, good. Now, a little bit harder. What's the buyer's share of the subsidy? What's the buyer's share of the subsidy? Okay, Erica, tell them what the buyer's share is. You should know. Where would I find the buyer's share? Yeah, it's the same thing again. This is the buyer's share. In this case, of course, it's falling. This is the buyer's share. The price is $10, now it's $9.80. So in this case, the buyers are only getting 20% of the subsidy. Most of it is going to the sellers. Now this is a little bit tricky. You have to be thinking, what is the seller's price? If I asked you right off the bat here what the seller's share is, you'd blow it. What is the seller's price? What does the seller get after the commodity is sold? And then the seller gets the subsidy. What is the seller's price? Okay, now look everybody, let's just look at this thing here. If I asked you for the seller's share without you thinking about this properly, most of you would show me this, and you'd be, in this sense, right for magnitude. This is the total amount of the tax, or the subsidy right here. Well, actually, okay, let's just say that it was this. This thing is shifted down $1, right? And of that dollar, this is clearly the buyer's share, and you would claim that this was the seller's share, but you would be wrong. In magnitude, it's correct. But in fact, the seller is not getting this amount, right? The seller's not getting this amount. What is the seller getting? What is the seller's price? Yeah. Yeah, exactly. You got to go up, and not up from here. You got to go up from here, right? So you want this. The seller's price is, here's the P1 plus the subsidy. There it is there, right? So the seller's price is here. It's up top here. The seller is getting not 80 cents less than $1 or something like that, $9.20. The seller is getting 80 cents more than $1. They're getting $10.80, and you got to show that. So the actual seller's share is up here. It's 80 cents. It's not a fall of 80 cents. It's a gain of 80 cents. Notice? Okay, then, what is the total subsidy that the government gives out? What's the area of the total subsidy? In this case, what is the total subsidy given out? Now, it could be here. Because, first of all, this is $1 vertically. This could be the total subsidy. There's $1 vertically. But that's not it, because we're not selling Q0. And in magnitude, this is in fact correct, right here. But actually, that's not where the total subsidy is on this board, because the one that we're interested in is here is the amount of the tax up here. So this is just a little bit different than the tax. If you understand the tax, probably you should be able to do the subsidy. Otherwise, you won't be able to do it. You just sort of copy it. Any burning issues in that? This will not be an exam. But I expect you to know it subsequently. This turns out to be a huge interest in economics, not just because of tax, but for any kind of per unit cost. Okay, now, that concludes what you need to know for the exam. Sales taxes here, equations you don't need to know. Diagrams you need to know. This stuff you need to know. This you need to know. This you need to know. This you do not need to know. Notice it's equations. Subsidy you do not need to know. Ready? But we're going to do equations now. So, let's do equations. Let's say, I'm going to go back to what it is we have there. I'm going to give you equations for this. All right, everybody? I'm going to give you equations for this. And I'm going to say, look at that. The demand function, the intercept term there is what? I'm going to say 15. Okay, make it 15. And what's the intercept term here? Look, no. There's no intercept positively here. The supply, there's no negative. You know, suppliers are not producing a negative this and that. But just to show this as a linear function, I need an intercept way down here. So, we'll do this. Describing those, I've got demand is P equals 15 minus 0.01 Q. All right? And supply equals minus 10 plus 0.04 Q. Those functions would pretty well fit what I do here. Everybody? Okay, now, how do I know here? Notice that this slope is much flatter. Everybody? The slope is flatter. It's just the slope. This one is steeper. Notice? Can't normally use it, but because they intersect right there, say, I can just look at the slopes. So the only thing so far as elasticity is concerned here is I don't have to get fancy with percentage changes. Where they intersect, the slopes are good enough. All right? That's important. You'll see subsequently. Okay, then, Now what I want to do is do all the same stuff I did before. Here's your question. You should be able to do this in an exam easy. But we're not going to do it in this exam. First of all, I want P0 and Q0. I want a solution. What is it? I want to know the original P and Q, the original equilibrium. 2 marks. All right, so what do we got? We've got 15 minus 0.01, Q equals minus 10 plus 0.04 Q. Probably on this exam I won't give you a minus just to start it off easy, but subsequently we can for reasons we'll explain later. And so this implies that Q equals 25 divided by 0.05, which is equal to 500, which implies that P equals 15 minus 0.01 times 500, which is 10, which is supposed to be equal to minus 10 plus 0.04 times 500, which is 20, minus 10 and 20 is 10. So far we're good. You've got 10 marks, got 2 marks. Okay, what is the new equilibrium P and Q? Given a tax of, I'll say $2, just because it'll make it a little bit interesting, but it's the same as $1, but you'll see what I mean. Call it, no, I'll say $1 because that's what we had before, $1. Now, by the way, without doing this, I know the answer within 10 seconds. And by the way, I know I'm the Q, by the way. I'll show you that later, a really sweet shortcut. And it'll also get to the thing. But for you, how are we going to do this? How are we going to figure it out? We know the demand is the same and the supply changes. How does the supply change? As an equation, how does it change? Yeah, go ahead. Well, yeah, how does the intercept change? Does it decrease? It's a tax, so we add $1 to the supply function and it shifts up by 1. So just add 1, right? So it turns out we solve the same demand function, which is what we did, equals minus 10 plus 1 plus 0.04 Q plus 1 implies Q equals 24 divided by 0.05, which is equal to what? $480. Everybody 480. So therefore, the price is P equals 15 minus 0.01 times 480, which is equal to, in this case, 10.20. Goes up by 20 cents. Kind of like we guessed before. But notice also, what I'm going to do is I'm going to plug this in to our supply function up here to see if this is correct, everybody. And so I'm going to put this in here, and I'm going to get minus 10 plus 0.04 times 480. And the weird thing is I'm probably going to get $9.20. Somehow I've screwed up because I'm supposed to get the same price. How did I mess up? Okay, Erica.
When you subtracted the equation, you did the original function that didn't include the tax.
Exactly. Sub it back into